Hello, I'm so happy to be with you today. We're going to be talking about a topic that's maybe not the most fun, the mess that's stress built and what to do about it. But if you are a caregiving parent, this is a very important topic and one that can help improve your quality of life and help you start looking at ways to deal with your physical, mental, and spiritual health in positive and proactive ways. I think this whole topic has become even more important because of the pandemic in the last year. There's a lot more people dealing with the same stresses that we deal with as caregiving parents all the time. And I think there's a lot more interest in what we're going to be talking about. But what I'm talking about began long ago. And for me, in my position as a writer and speaker, it started about 5 years ago when I was doing some workshops for parents about grief and guilt. And I discovered that as I spoke to them and told them that their responses, physical, mental, and spiritual responses to their lives as caregivers, were not anything that they needed to feel guilty about. They were just part of the life that they've been given. And once they realized that how they were responding, the feelings and sensations that they were having were normal in their abnormal situation, I could see the stress just rising from their shoulders. They sat up straighter. They had a little more sparkle in their eyes, a little more spring to their step. Just because they heard that what they were dealing with, their responses were not wrong or abnormal. Their responses were normal in the abnormal situation they were living with. And so I eventually decided, I think maybe there would be some interest in a book about this, but I need to gather some information first. So I just made a little survey that I put up on my website, differentdream.com, in I think 2019. And in a little bit more than a month, it kind of went semi-viral, and around 1,500 people filled out the survey, at which time I had to take it down because there was no way for me as one person to deal with all that data that was coming in. And if I got any more, it was going to be even harder to deal with. So I spent months combing through the data and finding out what people had said, and eventually interviewing some of those people as I prepared a book proposal for publishers. That book is not yet published. There may be more news on that later this summer. The pandemic, of course, has kind of pushed everything back. So there may be something about getting a publisher in the near future. We'll see. You never know with writing. But anyway, what I want to do with you now is go over a little bit of the information about what I found about how stress affects caregiving parents and what some caregiving parents have done to deal with that, because I think that's the important bit, isn't it? Not just to know that, yeah, what we're experiencing is real, but what can we do about this to deal with it in healthier, more proactive ways? So we're going to talk, first of all, about just some statistics that came from this study. First of all, 98% of the 1,500 people who were surveyed said that caregiving duties cause extra stress in their lives. And the number one stressor from a list that I created, sleep deprivation. 77% were dealing with sleep deprivation. Next highest at 44% was paperwork, whether it's medical paperwork, governmental, school, whatever, paperwork in general. And I could get that because the first 4 years of our son's life when he was young, he was really sick all the time, lots of surgeries, lots of emergency room visits. For 4 years, I didn't get a full night's sleep. And they were the longest 4 years of my life. I never could figure out why other parents said, oh, pay attention to your child when they're little, it goes by so fast. It did not go by fast for us. It took forever. And a lot of that, I think, was sleep deprivation. Now, the physical impacts of caregiving, let's talk about that. 87% of the parents said that caregiving had a negative impact on their physical health. And some of the conditions or symptoms that they reported were exhaustion, weight gain, pain, headaches, migraines, hair loss, autoimmune system failure, high blood pressure, and strokes. Now, the problem here was that the vast majority said they hadn't talked to a doctor because their caregiving duties didn't allow time for them to do that. And that's very troubling because as caregiving parents, we are hoping, most of us, to be around as long as we can to care for our children, even as they become adults and older adults. But if we aren't taking care of them, our time with them is going to be more limited because we're going to have our own physical issues that we're dealing with. So one of the parents who realized what was happening to her, well, she didn't realize that first, but one of the parents who I talked to, who was able to say, later I realized this was what was going on, told me this story about how she learned to deal with her physical issues. About 4 years after her daughter was born with some pretty significant special needs that required a lot of care, the mom had a physical breakdown. She started having gastrointestinal issues. She couldn't eat. She couldn't keep food down. She started developing food allergies. She was losing weight. She didn't have the strength she needed. And she started visiting doctors. She went to her family doctor, couldn't find anything. Went to an allergist. That person didn't find anything. Went to a gynecologist, nothing there. And a gastrointestinal doctor. And finally, she was just like out of options, and there was hardly anything she could eat. And so she went to a doctor that she had resisted, but someone had told her about this doctor. And she finally went to this person who was a naturalist. Now she was also a doctor, but she called herself a naturalist. And the question the naturalist asked that no one else had bothered to ask was, are you dealing with a lot of stress? And when this mother told the doctor what she had been dealing with for the last 4 or 5 years, the doctor said, I think your body is shutting down because of stress. You've got to regain your physical and your mental balance. And so with the help of this naturalist, she began doing that. She went to her doctor and found out what she could do and consulted with this doctor more and more. She took 6 months off of everything extra. If she was leading a brownie troop, she quit doing that. She quit doing extra things at church. She quit going out with friends and on social things. She only did what was absolutely necessary. And she began to take care of herself physically and spiritually. She concentrated on not overdoing at home. So what that meant was she was one of those people that when she was going to clean the house, she started in the morning and she kept cleaning for hours, a cleaning marathon until the house was spotless. She gave that up. She started maybe cleaning a half hour a day. And when she got tired, she quit. And then the next day she did what she could. She got her children, her typical children, involved in the cleaning also. And they started doing a lot more jobs around the house. So she just made sure that she was not overexerting at home and made sure she had periods of rest. Now, she was still having to care for this child with special needs. It required a lot of care, but she was able to find time to rest because she gave up a lot of other things. She also began reading about healthy ways of eating, eating more whole foods, more organic foods, whatever, concentrating on basic food groups, cutting out sugar, whatever. She read all about it. And as she got lists of ideas of what she could do to eat in a more healthy manner, she chose 3 of them, only 3, and implemented them. So just 3 things. Maybe she cut out sugar. I'm not sure what they were. Or she cut down on sugar. Maybe she started making sure there was fresh produce at every meal. But whatever, she did 3 things. She did not try to revamp her whole eating system. She changed 3 things and implemented them. She also started to ask for help, partly from her children, They were asked to do some chores around the house, but other people. She would ask them to bring meals. She would ask them to watch her kids. She would ask them to maybe pick up her groceries so that her load was lessened. And then as she slowly began to regain her health, and she did, and she's doing much better today, she also started finding simple ways to help others because she wanted to not just be concentrating inward on herself, but finding a way to think about others. It might have been that, she picked up somebody else's kids on the way to school, or she would ask people if they could bring in a meal, and then she would, when it was her turn to cook, she would cook twice as much food and take a meal to somebody else. So she was finding simple things she could do. So that's physical. Now, mental. What are the mental impacts on caregiving? According to the study that I did, 90% of the people who filled it out in that survey said caregiving had a negative impact on their mental health. Symptoms and conditions they mentioned included depression, sadness, uncontrollable crying, anxiety, panic attacks, excessive worry, post-traumatic stress disorder, and exhaustion. And again, the troubling thing about this, 92 of the people who said they had negative mental impacts from caregiving stress, only 92 of them had visited with a therapist. 92, just a fraction. So here's what one parent did. And it took her a while to figure out that her issues were mental issues to deal with rather than physical, because she had an adopted son who was diagnosed very young with nonverbal autism. And he's a teenager now, but he can sometimes be aggressive and self-injurious. And partway through this young man's childhood, the mom ended up in the ER with a racing heart, chest heaviness, sensations of skipping heartbeats, and lightheadedness. So she thought she was having a heart attack, a physical response. But the EKG and a heart monitor that she wore for a while came back looking good. So she went on her way, and a year later, the symptoms began to return, and she began to realize that her symptoms were typical of panic and anxiety attacks. She was dealing with a mental health condition that was manifesting in physical ways. So here's what she did. She went to her doctor and she tried medications, but she didn't like the way they made her feel sluggish all the time and unable to think. And she needed to be able to think quickly while caring for her child. So she started researching, and this is interesting because food came up in the person who dealt with physical issues too. She started just doing research on the connection between our guts and our minds, and how what we eat affects how we think and how we respond to situations. And she began to focus on nutrition. And she did a certain diet that she found that worked for her, that involved eating a lot of whole foods, eating very clean, and she began to get some of her energy back and her anxiety began to lower. She also kept a gratitude journal. She just started writing down the good things that were happening in her life instead of just concentrating on the negative things in her life. That she found very helpful also. And she also started a support group because she figured if she was having some of these issues, other parents raising kids with special needs were too. And a lot of the support group was done through a private Facebook group. I think they met sometimes in person, but they kept up with each other in this private Facebook group. They would tell each other about their struggles. They would ask for prayer requests. They would pray for one another, whatever. And that she found very helpful. Again, she was, as the person with the physical issues, she was starting to focus not just on her own condition and her own situation, but on what other people were going through. And that helped her become more mentally healthy. So that's a little look at the mental health care part of it. Finally, what about spiritual impacts? How does caregiving impact our spiritual health? Well, only 30% of the people in the study said that they experienced spiritual doubts and questions on a regular basis. Now, part of that is because in the study, I wasn't thinking that far ahead to think, what are the spiritual impacts on this? Part of it also was because I didn't want to delve into the spiritual too far, because I wanted to get a broad base of people to answer it, not just people who have a faith system in place. And so I didn't really ask that. Still, 30% of the people mentioned that their caregiving situation caused them to have caused them to have doubts about their spiritual walk. And I found that to be disturbing, because I think one of our main needs while we're caregivers is that we can draw upon a strength that is outside of ourselves and outside of our human capabilities. And to me, that means a higher being. So here's and I think the disability community needs that. That's part of why we're here in this conference today, whether you're in one of the groups that's able to meet in person, or if you're meeting and listening to this virtually. Caregiving families need that hope. And our churches, our synagogues, and our mosques are places where we should be able to get that. So here's what one person did. This parent had a first child who had a serious physical disability from birth and was later diagnosed with autism and has a lot of caregiving needs. They are caring for him almost all the time. And then they had a second child who was in NICU after birth for a little bit with heart issues, and those have resolved. But the mom, because of those two traumatic experiences in her life, became very anxious that she was not going to be able to function and care for her kids. And she started kind of withdrawing, and she was dealing with a lot of even some suicidal thoughts and wondering if it would be better for her to be dead. And she came to a point where she had to just cry out to God. And she says now that her darkest times, those hardest times, were when she was most in prayer and most in the Bible. And she felt closest to God while she was pleading with him for relief and clinging to him. And she discovered that when things ironed out and got better, she kind of pulled away from that. And so she realized that she needed to concentrate on her spiritual health all the time, not just when she really felt the need for God in her life. So here's what she did. She devised a way to become more consistent about spending time in Bible study each day and in prayer. She actually began highlighting in her Bible any psalms or any prayers that were uttered or any verses that she could go to when she felt anxious, prayers to ease her anxiety. She asked for prayer in a mom support group on Facebook. There's another support group. It's coming up again. Some of these things work, whether you're dealing with physical, mental, or spiritual issues. Excuse me. So she asked for prayer in that mom's group on Facebook. And as we know as caregivers, sometimes those virtual groups are what we can handle because of our caregiving duties, because of the difficulty of taking our kids anywhere or finding someone to care for them. So there's nothing wrong with that, being in a support group on Facebook. Just make sure you're in a positive one, where the emphasis is on positives, not on just always complaining and bringing up negatives. Here's what else she did. She asked church friends to offer practical support, whether it was bringing in a meal, watching her child, helping with whatever, practical support. And she told them what she needed. And then she just began talking more about how she was feeling with friends, with her spouse, wherever it was appropriate. She began talking more about feelings. And I think here it's a good time to mention too that if you're having trouble with those kinds of feelings, having an appointment, meeting with a mental health care therapist is a good idea. And even though that can be difficult because of our caregiving duties, One good thing that's come out of this pandemic is that there's a lot more mental health care therapy being done online. So you might be able to work something out so you can access those caregivers without having to leave your home. My sister is a mental health care therapist. She's been doing that for years because she and her husband, they live in Minnesota, and in the winter they go down to Arizona. And she still meets with her patients, her clients, through virtual things like this. So it can be done. Now, I want you to see all of the things that we have talked about today, the examples I've given you, not as directions I expect you to follow. They are illustrations of how you can build upon some basic fundamentals to reduce your stress while caregiving. Things like, watching what you eat, asking for help, getting professional help, talking about your feelings. And you need to take those and look at your situation and how stress is affecting your caregiving life and decide, what could I do? What are some things that I could do to change this and to deal with the stress? And the first thing you have to do is change your perspective. So shift your perspective from always dealing with the urgent things, the things that keep coming up every day that you have to deal with, and figure out a way, how can I deal with the bigger issue here? How can I deal with the bigger issues of stress in my life and start making some changes? And when you can step back and do that and make a little time to think about this and to make a plan, you need to start small. Like the woman who only chose 3 things she was going to, 3, I've got that now, 3 things that she would implement to change her diet, and not trying to revamp everything. Just come up with one thing at a time, I would say, that you're going to deal with. Start small. Deal with that one thing. Maybe it would be, how could I get a little more sleep? Is there a way I could take a nap in the afternoon when my child is at therapy? Whatever it might be. Could I start buying a bag of apples at the store and making sure I eat an apple a day? It can be that small. Having healthy food there for you to eat instead of going for a candy bar. But come up with one small thing and work on it. Work on it until you have it as a habit and you don't really have to think about it. Then think of one more small step that you could take. And if you keep doing that, these small good things start snowballing just like small bad things can, and they start making a positive impact on your stress levels. 4th thing you need to do is ask for help. Don't think you can do it alone. And this can be help from a higher power through prayer and Bible study or fellowship with others, but it can also be asking for practical help. Ask your neighbor if he could go down and get your mail and just drop it off for you so you didn't have to do that. Or ask somebody if they could pick up your groceries when you phone in an order. Or ask somebody if they would bring a meal once a week. Or ask a neighbor or a friend if you two could switch once the pandemic's over, of course. You could take turns watching kids for a little while so each of you gets a break now and then. But ask for help and be specific about what you need. And when people offer to give you a hand, when they're the ones that say, oh, tell me if there's anything I can do for you, have a list ready. Make a list of things people could do for you and ask them, well, could you maybe do this? Could you do this? And you might be surprised. They'll be willing to help. And then finally, be persistent. You have to be persistent about your health. Even though it's a little hard, keep at it. Keep making those changes. If you fall off the wagon for a while, climb back on and get started on that thing you were working on. And eventually you will see that you are making changes in your life and that you are better able to deal with your stress. And that's a good thing, because that means you're going to be around with your child longer. You're going to be a positive impact in his or her life as long as possible. And you are going to be living a better life too, because you are worth it. Your child is worth it. And I want you to know that whatever you do, God is with you. And he sees you as worthy and worth it too. Thanks so much. If you have questions you'd like to ask me, other than the discussion questions that will be part of this coming up, the next part after this, You can email me at jolenephilo@me.com. That's JOLENEPHILO@me.com. Or you can also contact me through my website, differentdream.com. Just go there, click on the contact button, and send me an email. I promise to respond. Thank you so much for being with me. And I hope that you're learning a wealth of information and being encouraged by this entire conference. And so many thanks to Karen and Michelle for putting it together. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.